Guten Abend euch allen und seid begrüßt zu die Kadima auf den Ekran. Und einen schönen Dank zu unserer jiddischen Diva Karen Feldman für ihre fantastische Musik. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's online event. My name is Faye Burston, and I'm the cultural producer of the Kadima, Australia's home of Yiddish language and culture. And huge thanks to our resident Yiddish diva, Karen Feldman, for her beautiful music that we were just listening to. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which the Kadima stands today with a Yiddish acknowledgement of country. Wir anerkennen die traditionelle Option von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich heint, das Bunurang-Volk, von dem Kulin-Volk, und wir geben ab Covid seine Eltern von Amol, von heint und von der Zukunft. We are thrilled to have with us tonight, or for him this morning, our very special guest, Professor Dovid Katz, live from his current location in the UK. Dovid is one of the world's leading Yiddish scholars and Holocaust history advocates. He is a prolific author and an outspoken critic of historical revisionists. He is a passionate educator who founded Yiddish studies at Oxford and then again later in Vilnius, Lithuania, where he currently lives mostly these days. We're not giving Zoom lectures around the globe. He is currently hard at work on his new Yiddish cultural dictionary and editing the, I can't read the rest of my thing, and currently his work on his UK and editing the web journal Defending History. And now I give you Professor Dovid Katz.
Good evening, friends in Melbourne and Australia, and good morning, good afternoon to folks around the world. Thank you, Faye, for your generous words. It's, for me, a personally moving experience to be back at Kadima, albeit virtually. It was exactly a decade ago that I had my wonderful stay in Melbourne, and one of the highlights was my 3 visits to Kadima. And perhaps I'll make a point about where we are in the history of Yiddish when I think of those 3 visits. Kadima became the address in Melbourne where I knew I could find dozens of incredible elderly Yiddish speakers who were robust in their 80s and 90s, a testament to the good life in Melbourne and Australia. But when I look back a decade later, and I think that almost none of them are alive today, I realize that we are living in a moment when the secondary blow of the Holocaust is hitting us, is hitting Yiddish in a very acute and painful way. To put it bluntly, we are losing the last native speakers who came to maturity before the onset of World War II. Now, there are many definitions, whether that occurs at 5 years, 10 years, 18 years, but however you look at it, the human lifespan is not infinite. So we're at that crossroads, and I will come back to that. Now, if I can manage to share the screen, does everyone see? Is that working? Okay, if I don't hear from anyone, I'll assume it's working. So I'd like to do a brief survey of 1,000 years of Yiddish, and after that, I'll be happy to welcome your questions, comments, arguments, and controversies with pleasure. Obviously, in this short time, I cannot do justice, so like anyone dealing with this in a short time, I will have picked certain topics that I think are crucial. Yiddish is the 3rd great language of Jewish history in a chain, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, a chain of thousands of years that's unbroken. When ancient Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language, its remnants fed into Jewish Aramaic, and then the 2 of them fed into Yiddish about 1,000 years ago at the dawn of the European Jewish civilizations. So about 1,000 years ago, the Jewish civilizations of Europe emerged, as fate would have it, exactly when the Near Eastern centers in Babylonia and elsewhere were collapsing. And with a spirit of traditional Jewish humor, the Jews named the countries of Europe by recycling beloved biblical names and words, or sometimes fishing out unknown biblical names and words. In the Iberian Peninsula, if you look at the southwest of this map, the Jews called it Sforad. Why Sforad? If you look in the Bible, it occurs several times in the sense of some ancient place in the Near East. No one even knows where it is. It was playfulness. Sforad, Hispano. It recalled the consonants of the words for Spain. Similarly, France, Francia, Zorfas, another obscure word. In the East, you had Canaan, based on the slave trade in Eastern Europe. This is not the land of Canaan, it's the son of Ham, one of the three sons of Noah in the biblical chronology of how the world became populated by different peoples and languages. For the Hungarian lands, they couldn't find a place, so they took Hogor, Abraham's wife or concubine. Sounds a little bit like Hungary, Hungaria, Hogor. In the case of Ashkenaz, or as the great-grandson of Noah, mentioned in Genesis 10 as one of the white Caucasian northern European peoples. So this area, Ashkenaz in Central Europe, was to be the cradle of the third great Jewish language, Yiddish. Now, the three languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, continued to live in Ashkenaz, although only Yiddish was a living spoken vernacular. That doesn't mean that Hebrew and Aramaic were dead languages. They were not only prayed and studied, but new works were written in them. The same Ashkenazic rabbinic scholar of 900 years ago, who would teach his pupils in Yiddish, would speak only in Yiddish, would write a commentary on the Bible or a community letter or document in Hebrew. And if he was a sophisticated enough scholar to be writing works on Talmud and Kabbalah, the two highest endeavors in this culture, that they would be written in Aramaic. So this is the Jewish trilingualism of Ashkenaz that survives almost intact in certain Hasidic Haredi communities today. So in New York, there are dozens of Yiddish publications for the masses of Hasidic people who are Yiddish speaking. There are Hebrew books on community matters, on Bible for teaching, and there are Aramaic books for new commentaries on the Talmud and Kabbalah. So this Ashkenazic trilingualism obtained for 1,000 years and continues. So it means that in the written language, there was one spoken language that was written, as it were, Yiddish. There were two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, of the ancient Near Eastern text, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the ancient texts of the Kabbalah. But Ashkenazic texts were written in all three languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, for the most part, with a clear functional distribution, as in the case of the hypothetical rabbinic scholar that I mentioned. Now, people are always interested in the oldest documents. Many Yiddish documents were lost. They were not sacred like a Sefer Torah. They were not written on expensive parchment, and many of the oldest are simply not dated. The oldest dated sentence is from 1272, and the oldest dated words, mostly names, are from 1096, the Chronicles of the First Crusade. To say a little bit about the structure of Yiddish, it is an arbitrary, unique combining at its core of elements from Germanic and Semitic, but in a specific way that is unchanged over the generations. The word for moon in Yiddish is not derived from the Germanic mond. It's not derived from the Hebrew yoreach. It's derived from the Hebrew levono. So it's levone. And the levone, the moon, the pronunciation, of course, varies depending on the dialect. To the Litvak, it's a Livone, as in standard Yiddish. In the southern dialects, it's Livune. In the old dialects of Western Yiddish, it was Livone. The sun, by contrast, is derived from Germanic Zun, and it's die Zun in the north and die Zin in the south. So to linguists and anthropologists, this is immediately a sign of a proto-language of all the Yiddishes of Europe going back to that period of around 1,000 years ago, when Germanic Zun fused with Hebraic Livone. And you cannot have a Yiddish dialect where the word for moon is yoreach or mond, or where the word for sun is shemesh. That would be a combination of Hebrew and German. It would not be Yiddish. So we're talking about a specific fusion that then merged. This is very important for understanding Yiddish semantics. The wealth of Yiddish often comes from near synonyms, not exact synonyms, coming from the different language components. In Yiddish, we have the word for important, wichtig. But if it's talking about people and the dignity and importance of people, it's choshev. Choshev Freund, Choshev Redaktor, the Choshev Menschen. If we're being a little bit facetious or funny, we use the Slavic-derived vajne. Aha, das vajne zap. So similarly here you have examples of a sefer on the right, the tractate of the Talmud, that has to be a sefer, not a book. And on the left, you have a very important, deep philosophic tome written by a certain fellow, but it's a book in Yiddish. It can never be a sefer. So Yiddish semantics is the most specific to Jewish culture, sensibilities, and history, whether or not the user is remotely religious. All kinds of other examples. For holiday Yiddish text, the latest biblical word in the book of Esther, we have Yom Tov, Yiddish Yontif, and there's no such thing as a Yiddish Chag. You do have from the same root Choge, the Aramaic form, Ches Gimel Aleph, that refers to a Christian holiday. So this opposition of Yontif to Choge, and of course other words too, I'm simply taking examples today, makes Yiddish unique vis-a-vis other languages, including modern Hebrew. Now, people have tried to make all kinds of rules that usually it's the Hebrew word that's more something more sophisticated than the Germanic. It's not so simple. The Yiddish word for healthy pride is stolz, to be stolz with your achievements, your kids, and your life. But if you are haughty and arrogant, the negative pride is gaive, in the southern dialects, gave. In the case of the word for God, we're into what linguists call Eskimo territory, where you, as well known, have all those words for snow. So God in Yiddish depends on your attitude to God. If you're calling out to the Reboine Shaloilim, or you're begging and arguing with Tatanu Zisinker, or you're talking about the universal deity God, there's a huge variety of words. Now, that primeval trilingualism, where Yiddish, Aramaic, and Hebrew had their functions, collapsed early on as a perfect system because the population of women and most men, in other words, everybody except the scholarly classes who could really read and write in Hebrew and Aramaic, needed a literature. One form of early literature that's a classic combination of East and West was to combine biblical narrative with European epic poetry. So you had many editions of King Arthur, Vidwald, Dukos Horant, medieval Germanic epics, rewritten in Yiddish, often with humor, where, for example, the knight in shining armor has to make a diversion to eat some kosher food that would leave the audience roaring. But then there developed this synthesis where if you think about it, the books of Samuel and Kings in the Bible and others lend themselves splendidly to the medieval knightly romance with comic elements. So the Sefer Shmuel or Shmuel book in Yiddish became one of the classics of old Yiddish literature, as did the Sefer Melochim. And women played a prominent role as readers, as authors, and as benefactors of many of these books. By the 1540s, when Jewish typography was becoming standardized, you had three Jewish alphabets: square Hebrew for the holy texts, the so-called Rashi font for rabbinic commentaries, and this font, Mashkit, I don't know if you can actually see it, Mashkit or Weiberteich for Yiddish. It's so different that even a modern expert of Yiddish has to struggle to read it and has to spend a few hours learning it. By the 16th century, Yiddish was producing its own masterpieces. The first great writer, Elia Bocher or Elijah Levita, a luminous grammarian of Hebrew and Aramaic, his most famous book is called Bovo de Antono. So what is this Bovo? This book was an adaptation of the Italian romance Bovo de Antono, where Bovo is the name of the hero. And that was itself taken from the English Sir Bevis or Sir Bevis of Hampton. Now, Bovo, spelt the way you see it here, Beis Veis Aleph, immediately brought to mind the Talmudic tractates that start with a name of that spelling, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra. So you have Aramaic spelling, an Italian name, Yiddishized, the Aramaic de, in meaning of, similar to that in Romance languages, Bovo de Antona, and here you have a magnificently funny tale, which has a lot of anachronistic elements that led to the humor of the work. By the 1560s, 70s, and 80s, the rabbinic classes were getting very worried in this Ashkenazic territory that too many Jews were having fun with these secular romances, which had elements of sexuality, elements of ungodliness, and frankly, an adoration of violent heroes who were knights in armor, so different from the Ashkenazic hero who is the scholar. Ashkenazic civilization is one of the most nonviolent in history. It had a very firm belief in the Torah, the entire Torah coming from God, in the world to come, a certainty in the world to come. And the rabbis fought back by creating a religious Yiddish literature, and its effect was to enable women and many men to compete with the scholarly classes in discourse and conversation by putting many of those rabbinic treasures into Yiddish. So the so-called Woman's Bible first appeared in the 1590s. This is an early edition, the Tzenerena. The name of it is taken from the Hebrew imperative plural feminine. Go out, ye daughters of Zion, from Shir HaShirim, from the Song of Songs. Se'eino Ra'eino. So it's Tzenerena, which is the 5 books of the Torah, of the Chumash, and the 5 Megillas that are read on different holidays, and certain other parts of what we call the Ashkenazic canon, not translated into Yiddish, but paraphrased with quotations from Rashi, from the Medrash, from many scholars. So to this day in traditional communities, a beautiful edition of the Tzenerena is a classic gift of a bridegroom to his bride. Now, in the modern world, those of us who were lucky to grow up in Western democracies, we know that the Christian majority countries have become the most tolerant, advanced, multicultural, and those of us who are interested in the history of ideas, when we read John Locke and other 17th and 18th century philosophers, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, we see that it was Christians who developed this idea of the separation of church and state. That makes it harder to understand that in medieval Europe, it was quite the opposite. Christianity was then the most primitive, violent, intolerant religion, and the happy generations of a peaceful Ashkenaz were to be disrupted early on by the Crusades from 1096, by the Black Death and the riots that followed, the Rindfleisch massacres, and many others. Now, to make a long story short, these Christian massacres or these Christian suppressions, oppressions of the Jewish and other minorities led to three resolutions, to three reactions. Many Jews converted to Christianity to save themselves. This was not genocide as in the Holocaust. In real genocide, there's nothing you can do to save yourself. You have to die because of who you are, who you were born. And in medieval Ashkenaz, you could convert to Christianity and you're fine. So many converted. Many decided to die of Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name in the firm Ashkenazic belief of the world to come, which was every bit as real and is to the traditional Ashkenazic communities today. And the third, these are not mathematical thirds, no one knows the percentages. The third escaped, ran away, resettled. And again, I'm making a long story short. In Eastern Europe, you had Christianity still very weak, and you had pagan kings for a long time in Poland and much longer in the Lithuanian Grand Duchy. And many of those who adopted Christianity formally were still pagan in real life. The word pagan is perhaps not a nice word, so we like to use the word multi-theist. To make a long story short, again, if you believe in the sun and the moon and the stars and the firmament, you are not likely to want to kill somebody over some story between two very similar religions who believe in the exact same Messiah, who are from the house of Jesse and David, who are simply divided on the point over whether this guy came once and is going to come again, or he never came and he's going to come the first time. So Jews were able to reestablish Ashkenaz in Eastern Europe, where Yiddish thrived and developed into three major dialects. The blue here in your northeastern corner is Lithuanian Yiddish, that is most different from the other two dialects, the southern dialects, Polish, Polish-Ukrainian. You have the southeastern Yiddish in the southeast, the lower right-hand corner, and the most populous dialect called Polish, Hungarian, etc., in the southwest of this territory. And those are the three dialects today. There have been many controversies. A book that was completed around 1611, the Zohar in Yiddish, was so controversial that it took a century of legal battles in Jewish courts to get it published in 1711. That's the Yiddish Zohar, the Kabbalah in Yiddish. In the early 18th century in Germany, you had a Weisenheimer, Aaron ben Shmuel, in the town of Hergeshausen, who wanted to make a Yiddish prayer book instead of the Hebrew prayer book, arguing that you have to understand what you're praying, not to translate, but to replace. As you can see from this copy and all the known copies, the rabbis tore them up and put them all in an attic where the entire edition was discovered a little over 100 years ago. In the 18th century, you have the German Jewish Haskalah, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment with its war on Yiddish. One of the reactions to that war was the rise of neo-Orthodoxy. A German rabbi, the Chassam Sofer, Moshe Schreiber, he moved eastward to Pressburg, today Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, where he developed the adherence to Yiddish of the ultra-Orthodox, which is to this day the driving force for the hundreds of thousands of Yiddish speakers in Orthodox communities. In the 19th century in Eastern Europe, The Haskalah, the Enlightenment, did not result in the assimilation that it resulted in the West, where Western Ashkenazim were simply becoming German Jews, but you had new movements, modern Hebrew, the invention of the modern Hebrew poem and novel and pamphlet and play. In other words, the use of Hebrew for modern genres. And you had a parallel development for modern Yiddish. By the end of the 19th century, both these movements were very politicized. Nationalist politics feeding into Zionism of the Hebrew creators led to Hebrew and Zionism being very closely connected. And the revolutionary politics of the 1880s and 90s and beyond led to a close nexus between modern Yiddish and an array of leftist movements: anarchism, socialism, Bundism, territorialism, communism, the SS, the SD, a huge variety that we shouldn't lump together. So this formula that you see here at the bottom, Hebrew plus nationalism equals Zionism, and Yiddish plus revolutionary politics equals Yiddishism, is a vast oversimplification. People like Mendele and Peretz were important writers in Hebrew as well as Yiddish before this alienation really began to take hold in the late 19th century. You had people like Bera Borochov, a founder of labor Zionism, being the founder of modern Yiddish studies and one of the founders of Yiddishism. But an oversimplification that explains something, or a lot of it, is perhaps a lot better than the huge mass of facts that are not categorized at all. That's Mendele Moiches Forem. He was born in Lithuania, in Kopel, Kapelle, but he moved to Ukraine, became famous in his years in Odessa. The young Sholem Aleichem, the great humorist, born in Pereyaslav, not far from Kiev. And Peretz, perhaps the first of them to become a conscious socialist and Yiddishist, but in a very sort of limited way. But still, he was very close to the ideology that became the Jewish Labor Bund. It was because of this amazing woman, Esther was her literary name, Esther Frumkin, although born Malta Lifshitz in Minsk, who spent years, first of all, inventing the curriculum for the modern Yiddish elementary school. 1898, 99, 1900, she was writing textbooks for children to study in Yiddish that was very revolutionary at the time. And in her appearances all over Eastern Europe, Esther was able, almost single-handedly, to turn the Bund toward Yiddishism and away from a Russifying or Polonizing assimilationism. Esther is not treated properly today by anyone because after the Russian Revolution, she became a communist and became the head of an important institute in Minsk in the Belarusian Republic of the Soviet Union, and came to a terrible end of being exiled to the Gulag by the Stalinists, where she died. And that modern Yiddish prose was largely a male enterprise, but it was women who helped launch modern Yiddish poetry. Fradel Stock in the United States invented the Yiddish sonnet, which again sounds like no big deal, but was a huge big deal in the history of Yiddish at the time. In Vilna, you had the origins of modern Yiddish studies around 1913 with Borochov and Nigger in their academic collection, the Pincus. Borochov died at the age of 36 in 1917, but he had inspired a whole group of scholars and activists to continue. So after the First World War in Vilna, Dr. Tzemach Shabbat, a famous doctor, acquired as his son-in-law Max Weinreich, a brilliant Bundist Yiddishist scholar, and they founded the YIVO. That's from the opening meeting in 1925. The major campaigns against Yiddish, the Berlin Maskilim, who are embarrassed about Yiddish, it's too ethnically Jewish, the 19th century Hebraists and the Hebrew-Yiddish War, modern Zionism and Neo-Orthodoxy, these anti-Yiddish trends continue to this day. I don't know the statistics, but take a look at the United States. How many Hebrew day schools are there, and how many have any study, let alone serious study of Yiddish as even a voluntary elective subject? In other words, there is no representation proportionate to the near 10,000 Yiddish authors who created a great literature and the heritage that's in the immediate family background of the children in these schools. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit, or at the eve of the Holocaust, and you had all these millions of Yiddish speakers. And the present, as I say, you have this number one, you have several thousand devotees, almost very few of whom, a handful of whom, raise their families in Yiddish today. In other words, how many secular Jewish families where there are children of 5 years and 6 years old speaking Yiddish, you can count them. I don't want to begin to count them, but very few. However, the few thousand enthusiasts with courses and clubs and seminars and webinars and songs and dance, they are a very important component, especially compared to zero. But no communities of living speakers emerging. Disturbing for many Yiddishists is point number two here, delinguification and exploitation. If you look on Amazon and elsewhere, you'll find Yiddish singing, Yiddish dancing, Yiddish jumping, Yiddish sex toys, anything that's commercially fun and has some emotional link with your grandparents, but nothing to do with studying, let alone mastering a serious language and culture. Um, you also have a lot of political use of Yiddish. As you can hear, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and I hope that 18 years in Oxford and 21 in Vilna didn't do too much to a Brooklyn accent. But I can tell you, after my decades in Europe, I've come across many, many students in Germany, in Holland, in France, many of them non-Jewish, who have mastered Yiddish as part of political leftism, that they are very anti-Zionist, sometimes anti-Israel, and by studying Yiddish, they find a kind of Judaism they can relate to, progressive, egalitarian, internationalist, socialist. And again, some of these people have really mastered Yiddish and made many contributions. In my years in Vilnius, I also have had to live through, at my own expense, I might add, the use of Yiddish for the new far right. The new far right in Eastern Europe loves American Jews, Israeli Jews, but hates the local Jews in Eastern Europe because of their historic narrative of the Soviet Union having saved their families from Hitler in the years 1941 to 1944, when the USSR, and many of these people had veterans in their families who fought in the war against Hitler. And we in the West tend to forget that there were no American or British or other allied forces in Eastern Europe when the Holocaust was happening. So a number of countries, especially the Baltics, sometimes Western Ukraine, invest in Yiddish institutes and centers as a cover for the Holocaust revisionism, the most salient feature of which is the glorification of Holocaust perpetrators. So Vilnius, for example, has a huge plaque in central Vilnius commemorating the heroism of Jonas Noreika, who killed thousands of Jews in the Holocaust. They are not honoring him because he killed Jews. They're honoring him because he was anti-Soviet. But this kind of dialectic and double talk is now very common, and Yiddish is a wonderful cover for this kind of politics. And now I come to point number three that secular Yiddishists often don't like to talk about, that there are 1 million Yiddish speakers among Haredim, the vast majority of whom are Hasidim. I will show you some magazine covers from the last several months. In other words, all from the year 2021. A cover of a magazine called Der Spaktiv, where the main articles are about amazing new technical machines. The best Yiddish magazine in the world today, in my opinion, Malis, in Monsey, New York, edited by several women scholars of Yiddish, with a fascinating monthly column about Yiddish. Malis. You have Der Stern, and you have a feature article about North Korea. Here you have Der Oitzer, which loves historic articles. This one is about the Cantonists, the forced participants in the Russian Tsarist army in the 19th century. Here you have Der Blitz with a science fiction story about Der Eis Hotel. So these dozens of magazines are a varied literature. No, there is as yet no great Sholem Aleichem or Mendele, but this is a living Yiddish culture with a living Yiddish literature. When I was very grateful when my recent book of Yiddish prose was published. But what does that mean to a secular Yiddish writer? That I had to wait years to get a grant, a few hundred copies are published, and my greatest fear is that I will die with 100 mint copies being found in the closet. These magazines are sold in the tens of thousands to people who pay for them and whose publishers are making a living from them because it's a vibrant culture. So the future of Yiddish is quite easy to see. There'll be millions of Yiddish speakers. We don't know what they will do with Yiddish. And there will continue to be a still unknown degree of preservation by these few thousand secular enthusiasts that goes all the way from song, from dancing, all the way to serious scholarship and creativity in Yiddish. So I'd like to stop there and turn it over to Faye and ask if there are questions and comments, and I'll do my best. And I hope I'll tell you I don't know when I don't know.
Dank, Dovid. What a fantastic lecture. We've had a few questions already. The first one was a private one from Yoni Moses, who said that, as with animals, is it not possible that languages are meant to become extinct once they've served their purpose? Is it possible now that Jews have migrated around the world as we have, that Yiddish is no longer necessary and should be allowed to become extinct?
That's a wonderful question, and I'm going to answer with my usual provocative style. I will submit to you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there is not one Hebrew-speaking family on the planet outside of Israel that did not live in Israel. So the modern Hebrew experiment has been a magnificent success in the state of Israel, creating a vibrant new language that is quickly becoming the Israeli language and with an amazing productivity. For the diaspora, it means the loss of any Jewish language. So the idols of the Jewish market today for the mainstream are perhaps Israel and religion. They're both wonderful. I'm not remotely against either. But the loss of any Jewish language is, from the viewpoint of the anthropologist, the ethnographer, the student of culture, an extinction of a people. In one of our classes that I'm doing this summer for the Workman Circle in New York, we're studying the works of Matis Yohu Mises, another incredible scholar, who at the Chernovitz Language Conference in 1908, he controversially began his lecture saying, there was once an Irish people with their own language. Now that they speak English, it's not the same. They're still wonderful people, but peoplehood requires its own language. So this extinction means loss of peoplehood, becoming Americans, Brits, Australians, Germans, South Africans of the Jewish faith who connect to an ancient religion and a foreign country, but have no linguistic distinct culture of their own outside the Haredim, who are demographically slated to become the majority of tomorrow's Jewish people, whether we secular Jews like it or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi Valens has a question. She's actually got a couple, but her first one is there a need for standard Yiddish? And what are the characteristics of Litvish Yiddish today?
Right. That's too much to go into depth now, but what we call standard Yiddish is the Yiddish whose grammar and spelling evolved largely from 19th century religious books, then through Mendel and Moiches Forum, accepting grammatical features of the southern dialects like the three genders, plus a Litvish-based pronunciation, where it's Zogen, not Zugen, Purim, not Pirim, Wein, not Van. The dialects of the North and South differ very systematically by the turning of a clock by one notch. So when I hear the Southerners, ooh, I know it's my oh. When I hear his or her, ah, I know it's my I, and so on. This standard Yiddish developed from what was previously standard Ashkenazic Hebrew, and it is used in modern secular settings. Now, until recently, standard Yiddish happily coexisted with real, hearty, rich dialects of North and South. When I think of my visit to Kadima, and I remember being amazed by the wonderful variety of Yiddishes, all mutually comprehensible. We are now in danger of losing any dialect and of a watered down standard, sometimes called Yivo Yiddish, sometimes called Klal Yiddish, sometimes called correct Yiddish, that is often becoming a minimalist, soulless Esperanto. So if you want to master Yiddish, I suggest you find any dialect, one of the dialects, and master that too.
A question from our beloved Zilberman twins. I don't know whether it's Laura or Razel or both of them asking this question. Could you please share a little about your current project, the dictionary?
Right. Well, all my life, my Yiddish teaching has been oriented toward trying to create new speakers, new scholars, new masters. And in that vein, I found I was not happy with any of the current English Yiddish dictionaries. And in my foolish youth, I would write articles about the over normativized, overly purist, cold, fake Yiddish of certain circles emanating, in my view, from New York. So instead of complaining, I decided to try to leave by the end of my life as full a dictionary as possible that would reflect diversity, internal variation, and an honesty about usage rather than some kind of purism that seeks at this stage of the Yiddish language to fix it, which I consider nonsense. So there are polemic undertones to the work, but I invite you all to come and visit yiddishculturaldictionary.org. It's completely free. You can easily copy it onto a Word or document or whatever you like. And please send me words that are missing as well as mistakes. So if you have an English word and you want another opinion on the Yiddish, please write to me and you'll find the address at yiddishculturaldictionary.org. Thank you.
Might be the next rival to Urban Dictionary. Yankel Dessau has asked about your new book. Yankel, I think you mean the dictionary, so you've already asked that question. Jess has asked, how has the Yiddish spoken by Hasidim changed from Yivo Yiddish?
The Yiddish spoken by Hasidim has not changed from Yivo Yiddish. It has evolved from the living Southern dialects of Poland and Ukraine. Many of the studies of Hasidic Yiddish today are awful because they compare Hasidic Yiddish to the fake, artificially created Yivo Yiddish rather than comparing it to 1970s, 1980s, the last manifestations of secular literary Yiddish, especially in the United States, although certainly not only in the United States. So Hasidic Yiddish, you saw from those magazines I showed you, some of them have names like Der Blitz and Der Heute. They are a continuation of our, in inverted commas and quotation marks, of our secular Yiddish magazines. In other words, Hasidic Yiddish is the current incarnation of living mainstream Yiddish. And if that's difficult for various teachers of Yiddish, purists or Yivoists or whatever you want to call them, I'm very sorry, but I respectfully disagree.
Yankel has clarified his question. He's asked not about the dictionary, but your new fiction work, Einstein of Skvir.
Yes, it's my fourth book of Yiddish fiction. When my father passed away in 1991, he was a Yiddish poet, Menke Katz. For some reason or other, I started writing Yiddish fiction that I never thought I would do. Perhaps it's some kind of hobby. I wrote some stories set in old Lithuania and others set in the world I knew, whether in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, in London, or elsewhere. And I was lucky. In the late 1990s, there were still dozens of Yiddish writers who were wonderful, harsh critics. I would like to mention the late Moshe or Meisha Eisenbud of Niezhizh, Belarus, who of course became famous in Australia. And it was a decade ago that I had my meeting with him where he criticized my earlier work. Make a long story short, he was one of the many who convinced me that my stories set in the modern world were very weak or rubbish, whereas those set in the old world of pre-World War I Lithuania reflected a world I understood better. So in recent decades, I've only written stories set in old Lithuania. So Einstein from Sphere is a collection of stories mostly set in Lithuania, with a few modern ones from earlier years that I never included in the book. As we get older, we want to include our stuff in books under the illusion that they'll survive us better that way. Who the heck knows? So anyway, I invite you to read the book. It was published by Leivik House in Tel Aviv, and I'd like to thank the director of Leivik House, Daniel Galai. Daniel is really keeping alive the world's only remaining Yiddish secular literary publishing house. So with no disrespect to all the works in English, etc., about Yiddish, Leivik House is the last island, and I was very proud to publish my book with them.
Great. Leon Orbach has asked, do the Hasidic publications use some commonly accepted or taught grammatical rules, and does it matter?
It certainly matters, but let me, there's many answers to this. I'll try to give one or two. What we call grammar is how a language is written up. There is no language in the world, in the universe, that is spoken as a natural language in the family that doesn't have a grammar. If it didn't have a grammar, you wouldn't understand whether I went yesterday or I'm going tomorrow, or whether I enjoy this or I hate this. In other words, all natural language has a strict grammar. That has been proven. Whether it's been written up properly, that's another issue. Next, turning to Hasidic grammar today. Hasidic publications have developed an orthography actually based on the moderate forms of modern Yiddish spelling. They have thrown out the silent ayin, but they've thrown it out even in cases where secular Yiddish keeps it. But I suspect that the questioner might have in mind the gender system and the case system, die, der, and das, fundi, funder. The case and gender systems have been collapsing in post-Holocaust Yiddish everywhere. I remember all the secular Yiddish courses in New York in the 1970s and 80s. And all of us who grew up in secular Yiddish-speaking families, we needed to study der, die, das, funder. Why? Because these were grammatical norms that have been collapsing. In pre-Holocaust Eastern Europe, the great Yiddish scholar Yudel Mark, in the Yivos journal Yiddish Farale in 1938 and 39, wrote a brilliant essay asking why Standard Yiddish then, 1938-39, maintains a case system that all the children that he had taught in Yiddish schools all over Europe had no idea about and had to study in school. So Hasidic Yiddish is not collapsing, it is evolving into a one-gender caseless language. And as we see from English and other languages, languages can do very well with one gender and one.
Fantastic. Sasha Hirschfeld, I beg your pardon, has said, if the Hungarian Hasidim are the future of Yiddish, given that they by and large consider Yiddish secular scholarship, literature, culture as treif, what does that say about the future of Yiddish?
Well, here I have to become humble and quote the prophet Amos in the Bible. I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. I went as far as I feel I could in predicting the future based on the facts we have. Nevertheless, let me try to answer you. As you saw from those few magazines I showed you, and as one of my courses now at the Abba-Taring, at the Workman Circle, is Hasidic Yiddish magazines. Now, we are reading cartoons and polemics, books about politics. We just finished a travel log about a trip to an amazing garden in Dubai. So Hasidic literature today is rich in stories and novels and travelogues and news and politics. It has not reached the level of great literature. It reminds me of our quote unquote literature of the mid-19th century. So that's number one. Number two, it is a fact that Hasidim regard as treif the literature hallowed by the secular Yiddishes. And for us, it's very, very painful that they don't want to read Shalom Aleichem or Peretz or Mendele. Now, what will happen in the future, whether from these millions of future Hasidim, whether some will leave the fold, moderate the fold, and continue their interest in Yiddish, expand it, I don't know. The way it looks now, our secular literature that we hold sacred is taught and studied by these few thousand people around the world in educational, academic, club, and organizational settings. Finally, the speaker asked about dialect. Most of Hasidic Yiddish today is very close to classic Polish Yiddish, not to Hungarian Yiddish. In fact, if you go to Borough Park in Brooklyn or Stamford Hill in London, it's becoming more and more difficult to hear real Hungarian Yiddish because standard Polish Yiddish, very close to the dialect of Yud Lamed Peretz, Hersh Dovid Nomberg, Yosef Apatoshu, Isaac Bashevis Zinger, all the great writers who came from that main dialect, Mid-Eastern Yiddish, or the bigger part of the southern dialects, that is the standard Hasidic dialect. There is a minority Haredi dialect that survives based on Litvish that sounds a lot closer to standard Yiddish, spoken, for example, by the old Yishuv in Jerusalem, by the Brisker, by a small group of Chabad in Crown Heights, although not by the Chabad International group. So we basically have a new standard emerging based on Polish Yiddish, not on Litvish Yiddish. And guess what? As a die-hard Litvak, I'm thrilled in the spirit of the real mother in King Solomon's story that Yiddish is thriving and surviving, even if it's not my cherished God.
Moishele, hi Moishele, is saying, what happened to the Vilna Yiddish summer program? Will it be resuming in the future?
I don't know.
COVID question.
Yes, no. I'm fine with it. I moved the old summer course that I had founded in Oxford in 1982 to Vilna in 1998 with a very specific motive, that students from around the world could learn from the incredible elderly Yiddish speakers in Vilna and in Lithuania, Belarus, and further afield who we used to bring to the summer course. So my idea was that it's a fantastic center for that reason. Over the years, as in Melbourne and everywhere else, with the limitations of the human lifespan, that group is no longer there, taking away that amazing advantage. But in my own biography, What happened was, I mentioned before, the abuse of Yiddish by the new far right. In 2008, a number of European Parliament members produced the Prague Declaration, declaring that Nazi and Soviet crimes were equal, declaring that the Holocaust and Soviet crimes were equal. And two of my dearest friends, Fania Bransovsky, who's now alive and well, close to 100 years, and the late Rachel Margolis, were accused by prosecutors in Vilnius of being war criminals because they escaped the Vilna ghetto to join the partisans to fight the Nazis. And guess what? The partisans were supported by the Soviet Union. And another thing, those who had been in charge academically, officially, but more administratively and financially of Yiddish studies were the same people on the State's Commission for Nazi and Soviet Crimes. So I decided, the heck with my career, I decided to stand up. I alerted the world, and in 2009, I founded the website defendinghistory.com, which Faye mentioned. In 2009, I was told that I would be fired because of articles I published in far left pro-Soviet publications. So a little bit stunned, I asked, what articles did I publish and what are these publications? I had by then written an article, well, three actually, one in the Jewish Chronicle in London, one in the Irish Times in Dublin, and worst of all, one in the Guardian online. So in 2010, I was discontinued, but the Institute of Yiddish was formally continued for summer courses only. It ceased to function for studies during the year, and the summer courses were a propaganda boom. And with money and honors and medals, it was easy to find Yiddish teachers who couldn't care less about the abuse of Yiddish and continued, and it fell apart as soon as the government felt it no longer needed it. Having said that, millions of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you count in euros are now being invested in Yiddish in Vilnius. As it has nothing to do with me, I cannot evaluate it, but I can tell you who's doing the investing. YIVO in New York, which doesn't do much Yiddish speaking these days, its director became a member of the Lithuanian State Commission on Nazi and Soviet Crimes that was behind the Prague Declaration, giving it legitimacy if the head of YIVO. So YIVO is investing millions, and the rumor is it is creating a new branch of YIVO in Vilnius. So please contact YIVO to find out what they will do. Then the Lithuanian government helped organize, together with the World Jewish Congress, a new World Yiddish Center in Vilnius. I am in touch with them. My former wonderful student, Victoria Yagnetinskaya-Yusa, is the director, and I invite you to find it on the internet and write to them about their plans. That's the World Yiddish Center that has two magnificent offices on the most elegant boulevards of central Vilnius. So you need to contact them. I don't see a future for Yiddish, but I would certainly love there to be small islands of serious Yiddish study in this part of the world. Study that is not a pawn of far-right politics, using Yiddish and its emotional associations to cover for far-right Holocaust revision.
Okay. There's one more question that's come from, it's a private question. It said, you mentioned the second wave of the Holocaust. Do you see that as a major influencing factor in the disappearance of Yiddish?
It certainly is a major milestone. Nobody can deny, in my view, that it's a milestone, that anyone who came to linguistic maturity before 1939 or 1941 is now sadly no longer with us or at the end of their active days. And that is a fact. So I meant to say by that the status of Yiddish only felt that Holocaust blow now. That when I was in Melbourne 10 years ago, and I was circulating among dozens and dozens of incredible Yiddish speakers doing well in their 80s and 90s at Kadima, that is an experience I fear I can no longer have. We then come to the associated question. What did this group do to pass on the language? We secular Yiddishists screwed up. I would like to use a stronger word, but I wouldn't dare. We made a huge mess of things. We didn't create new generations of Yiddish speakers. Those of us in secular Yiddish in New York, born in the 1950s, like myself, we were a tiny minority. We were ourselves considered something out of a museum, okay? Because even the greatest Yiddish writers in New York usually had kids who did not speak Yiddish or didn't even like Yiddish. So the secular Yiddishists, those who will talk with the greatest love and devotion about Shalom Aleichem and Mendele, did not create a single Yiddish-speaking street on the planet. That's the failure of secular Yiddish. Meanwhile, the Haredim and Hasidim, who couldn't care less about Shalom Aleichem, have created 1 million Yiddish speakers, many hundreds of thousands of them of childbearing age, who continue to produce children and speak to them only in Yiddish in the home. So the demographic future of Yiddish was successfully transmitted to the 21st century, not by the secular Yiddishists who write poems and odes and lectures to Yiddish and its beauty, but to the traditional Yiddish-speaking civilization of Ashkenaz in the spirit of that 1,000-year-old Ashkenazic trilingualism. That's where we are now, in my view.
It's an interesting point we're at, isn't it? There is one last question from Lucy Tuxa, who says, when I was growing up in Sydney, my grandparents read the Jewish news in Yiddish religiously. Of course, our Jewish newspapers, including the Forward in USA, stopped publishing in Yiddish. So the young no longer heard stories being read out at home. Can you please comment on the impact of having secular Jewish newspapers published in Yiddish?
Secular Jewish newspapers, or any kind of newspapers, are only a reality when there is a natural market, a critical mass of readers willing to buy the newspaper. With the collapse of secular Yiddish, with the dying out of the old generations and their failure to pass on the language successfully or at all to their kids and grandchildren, the Yiddish press was doomed as a natural phenomenon. So any secular Yiddish newspaper today has to be artificially maintained by huge subsidies and so on. It is not a natural market of any kind. If you look at some Hasidic Yiddish newspapers, I'm thinking in New York of Der Yid and Die Zeitung and Der Blatt, they are real newspapers with many thousands of readers who buy it and want to buy it. So the Yiddish press survives also only among Haredim as a reality.
It's an interesting state of affairs. That's it for the questions that have come through. If you've got any more questions, one more from Leon Orbach. Thank you for all your questions, Leon. All Dovid said about Yiddish in the USA Haredi community reinforced my thought about Yiddish being drowned by English pollution. And that's actually, he did mention that before. The infiltration of Haredi Yiddish by English words.
Right. One person's development is the other person's tragedy and collapse and invasion and infiltration. There were times when the Slavic element in Yiddish was considered a ruination of Yiddish. You can read secular Yiddish scholars before the Holocaust storming against the invasion of Slavisms, which in today's Yiddish are exquisite literary words. I mentioned Vajna before. There are many, many others. In the Soviet Union and in many non-Soviet Yiddish leftist circles, The Hebrew and Aramaic element was considered a clerical invasion by Haredim into our wonderful secular Yiddish, and there were wars against that component. Today, there is naturally an English component in Hasidic Yiddish. What I would argue to you is that every one of these magazines, the Yiddish books being published today, sure, they have an English influence that reflects the current state of the Yiddish language, as is only natural in America. We were reading yesterday, as it happens in our class of Ashkenazic Hebrew, a mixed document in Hebrew and Yiddish from New York, where it was a critique of the Common Core curriculum. So the whole thing was in Hebrew or in Yiddish, but the words Common Core curriculum were presented as English and Yiddish letters and spelling as a cultural reality, as a concept. So there are Yiddishists who say that you should not say subway, you have to have some invented word, that you shouldn't say Congress, that you shouldn't say this or that. That's not how languages develop. So I think Yiddish is interested in what's happening to the living language today. And I don't say you have to be interested in that. If you're interested in the classic literature, that's beautiful, stick to that. But if your field is current living Yiddish, it's not whatever fake classy new neologisms or purist concoctions appear very often in Latin letter evil transcription in emails or in newsletters on the internet. It's the Yiddish of real families in the Hasidic world. And if you look at their papers and their books, it is not a barbaric mess of English and Yiddish. It is Yiddish with a new English component, whether we want it there or not. We have to be humble. Who the heck are we?
Naomi had a question very similar to that, but I think you've answered it. Alex Katz said, what do you think about the proliferation of Yiddish in films and TV shows these days, like Unorthodox?
Oh, okay. I don't have too much to say about it, other than that in the film Unorthodox and in Shtisel from Israel, you at least had authentic sounding Yiddish, rather than the other phenomenon of films in English and other languages throwing in the odd Yiddish words because it's schmaltzy and cute and gives you some kind of high, or the comedy where the Native American says something in Yiddish. So in other words, these films, the Unorthodox Netflix series and the much longer Shtisel series, they at least represent portions of today's real Yiddish-speaking world. They didn't go to some scholar, what's the correct standard Yiddish of the scholar. Their Yiddish is taken from what's spoken today, although in certain limited communities. So that's all I'd really say about it.
Okay, along a similar line, Sasha asks, would you agree that the Hasidim's attachment to Yiddish is solely because it helps them to maintain a separation between themselves and the non-Jewish world, and not for any other reason?
No, I disagree vehemently with that opinion. Look at the secular attachment to Yiddish. I love Yiddish literature. But I'm not going to speak Yiddish to my kids. What kind of attachment is that? When it comes to a language, that's phony. It's bankrupt. The Hasidim don't say, I am going to talk Yiddish to my kids, so there'll be a separation between my kids and the others. They talk Yiddish to their kids because they never stop speaking their people's language. So the simple truth is often so starkly simple that it can evade our gaze.
And we have not a question, but a statement from Stanley Barkan, which might be a lovely way to finish this off. He said, Isaac Bashevis Singer, who when asked about the future of Yiddish, if it will survive, said, 100 years ago, people asked that question. Today, they ask that question. 100 years from now, they'll ask the same question. Bravo, Dovid.
Thank you. Wonderful to see you. Thank you. God bless, and have a good day.
Schönen Dank, herzlichen Dank from us at Kadima and from everyone joining us from around the world. Thank you very much. And Guten Abend.
Schön wie die Levonne, lichtig wie die Sterne, von Himmel am Matone, bist du mir zugegangen.